The night everyone applauded Richard Lawson was the same night his life quietly began to fall apart. He stood beneath the glow of crystal chandeliers, dressed in a perfectly tailored tuxedo, smiling for cameras that captured every polished angle of his success. To the guests filling the grand ballroom, he looked like the definition of power, a billionaire, technology executive whose influence stretched across continents. But if someone had looked just beyond his rehearsed smile, they might have noticed something else. Not fear, not guilt, something worse. The confidence of a man who believed there would never be consequences. Stories like this rarely begin with one dramatic moment. More often, they are built from small acts of pride, quiet compromises, and words that seem harmless until they change someone's life forever. Sometimes the loudest humiliation isn't the one everyone hears. It's the one history remembers. If you've ever watched someone underestimate another person because of where they came from, then this story may stay with you long after it ends. 3 years before the gala, Richard Lawson first met Amara while attending an international renewable energy conference in Nairobi. He almost missed the session entirely. His assistant had accidentally switched 2 meetings, forcing him into a panel discussion he considered far too academic. He sat near the back of the room, checking emails every few minutes. Then a young woman stepped onto the stage. She wore a simple emerald green dress. No expensive jewelry, no entourage, no dramatic introduction, only quiet confidence. "My name is Amara Ndlovu," she said, her voice calm enough that the audience leaned forward instead of tuning out. People often think Africa's greatest resource is beneath its soil. She paused. I disagree. Silence. Our greatest resource has always been the people who keep solving impossible problems after the rest of the world assumes they've already failed. Richard looked up from his phone. For the first time that morning, he stopped reading emails. Amara wasn't performing. She was speaking from experience. Instead of filling her presentation with impossible promises, she spoke about villages that had designed low-cost solar systems from recycled materials, women who had built community businesses without foreign investment, and engineers creating solutions specifically for African climates rather than importing unsuitable technology. Every example felt personal. Every story carried someone's name, someone's sacrifice, someone's hope. When the applause finally ended, Richard surprised even himself by walking over. "Impressive presentation," he said. She smiled politely. "Thank you. You didn't sound nervous." "I was. You hit it well. My grandmother used to tell me something." Richard tilted his head. "Confidence isn't speaking loudly," Amara said. "It's speaking honestly even while your hands are shaking." He laughed softly. "I'll remember that. I hope you remember the rest of the presentation, too." That answer caught him off guard. Most people tried to impress him. Amara challenged him without sounding disrespectful. For reasons he couldn't explain, he wanted another conversation. Then another. Then another. Then another. Over the following year, Richard found reasons to travel across East Africa more often than his schedule required. Officially, he was exploring investment opportunities. Unofficially, he was searching for coffee shops where Amara liked to work, markets where she volunteered, bookstores she visited on quiet Saturday mornings. She never seemed interested in luxury. When he invited her to 5-star restaurants, she often suggested neighborhood cafes instead. When he offered expensive gifts, she redirected the money toward local education programs. "You really don't enjoy expensive things, do you?" he asked once. She stirred her tea. "I enjoy meaningful things. There is a difference." "A very large one." She pointed toward an elderly man repairing children's bicycles beneath a tree. "He earns in 1 month what some executives spend on lunch." Richard nodded. "So?" "He sleeps peacefully." Richard followed her gaze. The old mechanic laughed with every child who approached. "No hurry, no performance, no audience, just quiet purpose." Amara smiled. "We measure success differently." Richard admired that about her. At least, he believed he did. When they married 18 months later, many business magazines celebrated it as an international love story. The billionaire entrepreneur, the African sustainability expert. Photographs of their wedding spread across newspapers worldwide. Few people noticed that. Amara requested a private ceremony attended mostly by family and lifelong friends. Richard agreed, at the time. But success changes some people. Sometimes slowly, sometimes almost invisibly. Within months of moving into Richard's enormous estate outside London, Amara began noticing small differences. Nothing dramatic, just comments. At dinner parties, Richard occasionally introduced her by saying, "This is my wife, Amara. She grew up in a small village, but she's adjusted surprisingly well." The guests usually laughed politely. Amara smiled. Inside, something tightened. One evening, she gently mentioned it. "You know," she said while watering flowers in their garden, "I don't think you realize how those introductions sound." Richard looked confused. "What do you mean? Adjusted surprisingly well?" "I was complimenting you. It didn't feel like one." "You always overthink these things." She looked down at the watering can. "I hope you're right." Richard kissed her forehead. "You know I love you." "I know." She believed him. At least then. Months passed. His jokes became more frequent. "So Amara taught me not every African lion roams outside the kitchen window." Laughter. "It turns out they even have excellent universities over there." More laughter. "It's amazing what globalization can do." Even more laughter. Each joke sounded harmless alone. Together, they formed a pattern. One evening after another charity dinner, Amara asked quietly, "Do you notice everyone laughs before looking at me?" Richard shrugged. "They know it's humor." "Does humor always require someone's dignity?" He sighed. "You take everything personally." "No." She looked out the window. "I simply notice what everyone else ignores." Meanwhile, another story was unfolding quietly behind closed doors. Richard's board of directors had begun pushing for a massive infrastructure agreement involving several African nations. The project promised billions. Publicly, the company described it as sustainable development. Privately, the numbers didn't add up. Communities would lose farmland. Local businesses would disappear. Environmental reports had been edited. Several independent experts refused to approve the proposal. Richard considered them obstacles. Amara considered them warnings. One evening, she reviewed several public documents lying on his office desk. "Richard!" He didn't look up. Who prepared these environmental assessments?" "Our consultants. They contradict field reports. They simplify them. They erase entire villages." Richard finally raised his eyes. "You don't understand corporate negotiations. I understand honesty." He stood. "This isn't your field." She stared at him. He immediately regretted saying it. "My entire career has been evaluating sustainable development projects." "I didn't mean—" "No." She closed the folder carefully. "I know exactly what you meant." For the first time since they met, silence lingered between them long after the conversation ended. Weeks later, invitations arrived for the Global Leadership Excellence Gala. Presidents, prime ministers, royal representatives, international investors, philanthropists, media from around the world. Richard considered it the biggest evening of his career. "It'll be unforgettable," he said while adjusting his tie. Amara looked at the invitation. "I hope for the right reasons." He laughed. "You're worrying again." "No." She folded the invitation. "I'm listening to something you can't hear." "And what's that?" "The direction pride usually walks." Richard smiled dismissively. "You always speak in riddles." "My grandmother did too." He kissed her cheek and returned to answering emails. He never asked what she meant. On the morning of the gala, Amara stood alone in the dressing room. Instead of choosing one of the designer gowns Richard's stylist had prepared, she quietly opened a wooden box wrapped in deep blue fabric. Inside rested a breathtaking, hand-woven royal garment embroidered with intricate gold thread. She gently touched it. Memories flooded back. Her grandmother's hands. Traditional songs. A promise made years ago. There was history stitched into every pattern. History almost no one outside her family understood. A house attendant knocked softly. "Mrs. Lawson?" "Yes?" "Mr. Lawson asked if you'll wear the silver European gown instead." Amara smiled sadly. "Tell him I'll be downstairs shortly." The attendant nodded. After the door closed, Amara looked once more at the traditional garment. Then she whispered almost to herself, "Not tonight." She carefully returned it to the box. Instead, she wore the elegant silver gown Richard preferred. As she closed the lid, her fingers rested briefly on an old family seal carved into the wood, a symbol almost forgotten by the outside world. Almost. She didn't know that, across the city, several arriving heads of state had already received an updated guest list. One name on that list caused more than one distinguished guest to pause before entering the ballroom, not because of the surname Lawson, but because of the name that appeared before it. Amara. And as the first limousines rolled beneath the floodlights outside the Gala venue, a quiet chain of phone calls began between diplomats, security advisors, and protocol officers. No one explained why. Not yet. And inside the ballroom, Richard was preparing to make the speech that would change everything. The Grand Meridian Ballroom had hosted kings, presidents, Nobel Prize winners, and business magnates for nearly half a century. Yet that evening felt different. Outside, black vehicles lined the entrance for nearly half a mile. Security officers moved with practiced precision. Television crews adjusted lights while photographers called out the names of arriving dignitaries. Inside, every crystal chandelier reflected hundreds of tiny lights across polished marble floors. It was the kind of room where every smile carried a purpose. Richard Lawson loved rooms like this. He'd spent years earning an invitation to stand among people who shaped economies and influenced governments. Tonight, he wasn't just attending, he was receiving the Global Leadership Vision Award. As guests filled the ballroom, Richard greeted investors with confident handshakes. Minister Alvarez, Ambassador Chen, President Okoro, it's an honor. Every conversation added another layer to the image he had carefully built. The image of a man destined for even greater influence. Across the room, Amara moved quietly through the crowd. Unlike Richard, she wasn't trying to be noticed. She asked an elderly server if he had been working long hours. She complimented the floral designer on the arrangements. She stopped to speak with a young violinist, who admitted this was her first performance at such an event. "You look nervous," Amara said warmly. "I've never played before so many important people." Amara smiled. "The music isn't for important people." The violinist looked confused. "It's for anyone willing to listen." The young musician relaxed almost instantly. One conversation. One moment. That was Amara's gift. She had a way of making people feel seen without asking for attention herself. Several guests noticed, including people Richard never realized were watching. Boop, boop. An hour later, the ballroom buzzed with quiet anticipation as everyone took their seats. The master of ceremonies stepped onto the stage. "Ladies and gentlemen, tonight we celebrate individuals whose leadership has crossed borders and transformed lives." Applause echoed across the room. Richard adjusted his cufflinks. Everything was unfolding exactly as planned. At least, so he believed. Before the awards began, guests mingled over dinner. Richard found himself standing with several influential executives discussing international investments. One of them glanced toward Amara. "Your wife seems popular." Richard laughed. "She's naturally charming." Another executive smiled. "She appears to know several African ministers." Richard shrugged. "She's worked on community development projects over there." "Over there?" Richard chuckled. "You know what I mean." Someone asked where Amara had grown up. Richard answered before she could. "A very small village?" He smiled confidently. Honestly, when we first met, she had never attended anything remotely like this. A few people laughed politely. "So tonight must feel overwhelming." Richard continued. "I keep telling her not to worry about all the formal etiquette." More laughter. "She's still learning." Amara had arrived quietly behind him. She heard every word. No one noticed her standing there. One executive finally looked past Richard. "Oh!" The laughter stopped. Richard turned. "Oh, sweetheart." He smiled as though nothing unusual had happened. "We were just talking." "I know." Her voice remained calm. "I heard." There was no anger, no raised voice, only disappointment. Sometimes disappointment weighs far more than rage. Richard reached for her hand. She gently stepped aside. One movement, barely noticeable. Yet several guests exchanged silent glances. Dinner continued. Conversation shifted. The uncomfortable moments seemed forgotten. But Amara spoke less than usual, not because she had nothing to say, because she was choosing her words carefully. She had learned long ago that silence often revealed more than arguments. Across the ballroom, an elderly diplomat watched her thoughtfully. He whispered something to the woman seated beside him. She nodded immediately. Another quiet exchange. Another curious glance toward Amara, the evening's keynote speaker, took the stage. For nearly 20 minutes, discussions centered on innovation, cooperation, and global responsibility. Richard applauded enthusiastically. The irony escaped him. Every speech celebrated dignity, respect, partnership. Words he applauded publicly, values he had quietly neglected in private. During a short intermission, Amara stepped onto the terrace overlooking the city skyline. The cool evening breeze carried the distant sound of traffic far below. She rested both hands on the stone railing, still finding quiet corners. The familiar voice made her smile. She turned. Standing behind her was an elderly African gentleman wearing a dark formal suit decorated with a modest lapel pin. His posture reflected decades of public service. "Minister Doob!" He laughed softly. "You still call me minister? You earned the title." "So did you." She lowered her eyes. "I've never believed titles matter very much." "They don't." He joined her at the railing. "Character does." For a few moments, they admired the city lights without speaking. Finally, he asked, "Does your husband know?" Amara answered after a long silence. "No." "He never asked." "No." "And you never told him?" "He loved the version of me he imagined." The minister studied her expression. Sometimes hiding the truth protects peace. She looked toward the ballroom doors. But eventually, peace built on misunderstanding becomes another kind of lie. Before either could continue, a protocol officer approached hurriedly. "Minister." He nodded respectfully. "They're asking whether special arrangements should remain in place." The minister glanced toward Amara. "Yes," he answered without hesitation. "Everything remains exactly as planned." The officer disappeared. Amara frowned slightly. "What arrangements?" The minister smiled. "You'll understand soon enough." Before she could ask another question, he returned to the ballroom, leaving her alone with more questions than answers. Inside, Richard's assistant hurried across the room carrying a tablet. "Richard!" "What is it?" "We've had several unusual requests." "What kind of requests?" "The protocol office wants confirmation that your wife will remain seated at your table throughout the ceremony." Richard frowned. "That's odd." "They also asked whether she'd require a private reception afterward." He laughed. "Private reception?" "Yes." Richard shook his head. "She's my wife, not a visiting head of state." His assistant smiled awkwardly. "I thought it seemed unusual too." Richard dismissed the matter. Someone probably mixed up the guest list. He never considered another possibility. The award presentations began. Names were announced. Standing ovations followed. Each recipient delivered polished speeches about perseverance and leadership. Richard barely listened. He mentally rehearsed his own remarks. His acceptance speech had been edited nearly 20 times. Every sentence had been designed to impress. Every pause carefully timed. Nothing had been left to chance. Except one thing. His own pride. Finally, the presenter smiled. "Our next recipient has built one of the world's fastest-growing sustainable technology companies while creating international partnerships across multiple continents." Applause erupted. "Please welcome Mr. Richard Lawson." The audience stood. Richard adjusted his jacket before walking confidently toward the stage. Camera flashes exploded across the ballroom. He accepted the Crystal Award with practiced humility. "Thank you." More applause. He smiled warmly. "This honor belongs not only to me, but to every member of my incredible team." He thanked investors, mentors, colleagues, partners. The speech unfolded exactly as rehearsed, until he reached the final section. And finally, he looked toward Amara. "My wife!" Spotlights immediately found her table. She smiled politely. Richard laughed lightly. "When we met, she came from a very simple background." Scattered chuckles. "I suppose tonight proves dreams really do come true." A few more laughs. "I always tell her." He paused dramatically. "You can take someone out of a village." The audience waited. "But sometimes it takes a little longer to take the village out of someone." Several guests laughed. Others didn't. Richard continued anyway. "I've spent the last few years teaching her how these international events work." His smile widened. "It's been a rewarding project." This time, the laughter sounded thinner, forced, uncertain. One camera operator slowly lowered his equipment. An ambassador folded his arms. Near the front row, a Queen's representative exchanged an uneasy glance with another delegate. Amara remained seated. Her expression didn't change. If anything, she looked almost peaceful. Richard mistook her silence for acceptance. He wasn't paying attention to the room anymore. He was enjoying himself. And if anyone wonders why she speaks so confidently these days, he laughed again. I suppose some habits really are contagious. Only a handful of guests laughed now. Most remained silent. Richard finally noticed. He frowned almost imperceptibly. Why had the atmosphere changed? He couldn't understand it. His joke had always worked before. As he prepared to conclude his speech, movement appeared near the ballroom entrance. Several protocol officers entered quietly. Not rushing, not panicking, simply moving with unusual purpose. The master of ceremonies looked briefly toward them. His expression shifted. Then he received a folded note. He read it once, then again. His eyes widened almost imperceptibly. Richard continued speaking, unaware. And together, my wife and I represent what international partnership can become. He raised the award. Thank you. Applause followed, but it lacked the warmth he expected. Something invisible had settled over the room. The master of ceremonies approached the microphone again. Ladies and gentlemen, his voice sounded noticeably different. There has been a small adjustment to this evening's official protocol. Richard smiled politely, assuming another award had been added. Instead, the presenter unfolded a second sheet of paper. He looked directly toward Amara. For the first time all evening, he addressed her not as Mrs. Lawson, but by another name. A name almost no one in the audience had expected to hear. The ballroom fell into complete silence. Richard slowly turned toward his wife. Confusion crossed his face, because the name the presenter had just spoken wasn't the name he thought he knew. The silence did not break all at once. It spread across the ballroom like a ripple across still water. Richard stood on the stage, the crystal award still in his hands, waiting for the master of ceremonies to continue. Around him, conversations had stopped. Even the photographers lowered their cameras, sensing that something far more important than another award was unfolding. The master of ceremonies glanced toward the protocol officers before speaking again. Ladies and gentlemen, he said carefully, before we proceed, we have received confirmation from the International Protocol Office that we are in the presence of Her Excellency Princess Amara Ndlovu of the House of Ndlovu, Honorary Cultural Custodian and Special Ambassador for the Pan-African Heritage Council. A collective gasp swept through the ballroom. Richard blinked. Princess? He turned toward his wife. Amara had not moved. She remained seated exactly where she had been, her expression calm, almost sorrowful, as though she had hoped this moment would never arrive. Then something remarkable happened. One by one, leaders from across the room rose to their feet. A president, a queen's representative, foreign ministers, diplomats, traditional leaders. Soon nearly everyone with knowledge of diplomatic protocol was standing in respectful acknowledgement. The applause that followed was not loud. It was deliberate, respectful, earned. Richard remained frozen on the stage, unable to understand what he was seeing. For the first time in years, he had no speech prepared. No clever remark, no joke, only questions. The truth, however, was far more complicated than titles or ceremonies. Amara had never hidden who she was. She had simply refused to let her family name define her. When Richard first met her in Nairobi, she had introduced herself exactly as she introduced herself to everyone else. My name is Amara Ndlovu. She never added the titles, never mentioned generations of leadership, never spoke about the scholarship foundation her family had funded across several countries, never explained that many of the people Richard considered influential had known her family for decades. She believed respect should be offered because of character, not inherited status. Richard had never asked. He had assumed he already knew her story. That assumption now stood exposed before hundreds of witnesses as he slowly descended from the stage. The weight in his hands no longer felt like an award. It felt like evidence of everything he had misunderstood. Across the ballroom, Amara finally met his eyes. There was no triumph in her expression, only quiet disappointment. She had never wanted to prove herself. She had only wanted to be loved without needing to. Richard stopped a few feet from their table. The applause had faded, but the silence that replaced it felt even heavier. For years, he had believed he understood influence. He thought it came from wealth, headlines, and invitations to exclusive rooms. Now he stood in one of those very rooms and realized respect could not be purchased. It had to be earned. Amara slowly rose from her chair. Several dignitaries approached, not to overwhelm her with ceremony, but to greet her warmly. An elderly president smiled. "It has been too long, Princess Amara." She shook her head with a gentle laugh. "Please, just Amara." A woman who led a humanitarian coalition embraced her. "My grandmother still speaks about your family's education initiative." "I'm glad it helped," Amara replied. A traditional leader from southern Africa bowed his head slightly. "Your grandfather would be proud of the work you've continued." Richard listened in stunned silence. No one spoke about her title with awe. They spoke about her service, her schools, her conservation projects, her work in preserving cultural heritage while investing in modern education. It slowly became clear why so many leaders knew her. Not because she had inherited influence, because she had spent years using it quietly. The master of ceremonies returned to the microphone. "There is one additional note." The ballroom settled once more. "Our organizing committee had planned a surprise recognition this evening." A large screen behind the stage lit up. Photographs appeared one after another. Amara sitting on the ground reading to children beneath a baobab tree. Amara helping install solar panels in a rural clinic. Amara speaking with women running agricultural cooperatives. Amara walking through flood-affected villages wearing simple boots covered in mud. No designer dresses, no luxury, no cameras following her, just work. The narrator continued. "For more than a decade, Amara Ndlovu has quietly supported educational scholarships, rural health programs, clean energy initiatives, and cultural preservation projects across multiple African nations. She requested that her contributions remain anonymous whenever possible." Another image appeared. A handwritten note from a schoolchild. "Thank you for believing in us before anyone else did." The room fell completely silent. Several guests wiped away tears. Richard lowered his head. He couldn't remember the last time he had looked beyond the elegant life they shared. He had admired the woman beside him, but only through the narrow lens of his own assumptions. When the ceremony ended, the ballroom gradually emptied. Reporters gathered outside, eager for interviews. Richard found Amara standing alone in a quiet hallway overlooking the city's lights. For several moments, neither of them spoke. Finally, he broke the silence. "Why didn't you tell me?" She looked at him with tired eyes. "I did." He frowned. "No, you didn't." "I told you my name the day we met." She paused. "I told you about my grandparents. I told you why service mattered to me." "You never asked another question." Richard searched his memory. She was right. He had heard her words, but he had never truly listened. "I thought," he began. "You thought you already knew who I was." She finished the sentence gently. He nodded, ashamed. "I've spent years making jokes at your expense." "I know. I convinced myself they were harmless." "I know. I embarrassed you." She didn't answer immediately. Instead, she looked toward the lights beyond the window. What hurt wasn't the jokes. Richard looked surprised. It was that the person who claimed to love me never became curious enough to know me. Those words struck harder than any public humiliation, because they were true. Several weeks passed. Richard canceled television appearances. He postponed business celebrations. More importantly, he ordered an independent review of the infrastructure project his company had been pursuing. The findings confirmed Amara's concerns. Entire communities would have been displaced. Environmental risks had been minimized. Contracts favored foreign investors over local businesses. For the first time in his career, Richard stood before his board and said, "We're not moving forward." Some directors objected immediately. "The profits are not worth the cost. The shareholders will understand. And if they don't," Richard took a deep breath, "then I'll explain why leadership without integrity isn't leadership at all." The room was silent. He had spent years protecting his reputation. Now he was willing to risk it for something far more valuable, his character. Months later, Richard traveled with Amara, not as the center of attention, but as a student. He visited villages where she had worked long before they met. He listened to teachers describe how scholarships had changed entire communities. He met engineers who had built affordable clean energy systems using local materials. He discovered that the stories Amara once shared over coffee had names: faces and generations behind them. One afternoon, they returned to the same village where Amara had spent much of her childhood. Children ran through the dusty streets laughing. An elderly woman sitting beneath a large tree smiled as they approached. "My granddaughter always said you'd come back." She embraced Amara first. Then she looked at Richard. "So," she said with a playful smile, "have you finally learned to listen?" Richard laughed, a genuine, humble laugh unlike any he had offered before. "I'm still learning." The old woman nodded. "Good. No one ever finishes." A year later, another international gala invited Richard to receive a different award. This time, he accepted only on one condition. His speech would remain exactly as he wrote it. When he stepped onto the stage, the audience expected another polished celebration of business success. Instead, he began differently. "The greatest mistake I ever made wasn't in business." He looked toward Amara. "It was believing I understood someone I had never truly taken the time to know." The ballroom became still. "I once measured people by where they started. I now understand the only measure that matters is how they choose to serve others." He smiled softly. "My wife taught me that." When he finished, he walked back to his seat without another word. The applause that followed felt different from the applause he had received the previous year. It wasn't for achievement. It was for honesty. As they left the venue together, Richard reached for Amara's hand. This time, she took it. Not because the past had disappeared, but because genuine change is proven through consistent action, not perfect apologies. They stepped into the cool evening air, leaving behind another ballroom, another ceremony, and another chapter of their lives. Amara looked up at the stars. "My grandmother used to say that a person's true name isn't the one written on a birth certificate." Richard smiled. "What did she mean?" "It's the name people remember after they've experienced your kindness." He looked at her thoughtfully. "And what's yours?" She smiled. "I'm still earning it." Richard nodded. "So am I. Sometimes the greatest revelation isn't discovering who someone truly is. It's discovering how little we knew because we never stopped to ask." Respect begins where assumptions end. And the strongest relationships are built not on status, wealth, or appearances, but on humility, curiosity, and the willingness to truly see another person. If this story made you reflect on the power of humility, respect, and looking beyond appearances, thank you for spending these moments here. Until next time, remember, the people we underestimate often carry the stories that can change us the most.